The Sauber name almost didn't take part in the 2010 Formula 1 season. After 4 years of BMW ownership, the German manufacturer completely pulled out of Formula 1 following the 2008 financial crisis. And with all 13 team slots for 2010 completely filled, it looked like Sauber might bite the bullet. But when Toyota confirmed their withdrawal from the sport as well, Sauber was given the lifeline they needed to persevere. With the team sold back to its founder, Peter Sauber, the team would continue to use the BMW name for the 2010 season despite the fact that the brand new C29 didn't have any BMW parts, utilising Ferrari engines instead and being designed entirely in-house at Hinwil in Switzerland. The team would be almost entirely sponsorless that season, owing to the late confirmation of the team, and it would take on 2 new drivers, perennial test driver Pedro de la Rosa and Japanese driver Kamui Kobayashi. The first half of Sauber's season would not be very good, as out of 12 entries in the first 6 races, the Sauber cars could only finish twice in non-points paying positions, with reliability being one of the major issues that the C29 had, at least in the first few races of the season. These issues would gradually be ironed out, and the performance of the car would improve, with points slowly becoming a regular occurrence at the hands of Kobayashi, though De La Rosa could only manage a single 7th place to his name. Thus he would be replaced by Nick Heidfeld, who had scored several podiums for the team's former incarnation as BMW. He would prove to be a marginally better replacement for De La Rosa, as he would score twice in the final 5 races. With the C29 scoring more frequently in the later half of the season, it was sort of a reversal in fortunes compared to the Force India team, who had worse results as their season went on. But this uptick in performance came just a bit too late, as whilst the team was scoring reasonably well towards the end of the season, they weren't scoring enough, and of course they failed to score at all in the first 6 rounds, damaging their chances of finishing any higher than 8th in the Constructors' Championship with just 44 points. Sauber, now actually named Sauber and not BMW, entered the C30 into the 2011 Formula 1 World Championship, and finished well in the first round of the season in Australia, finishing 7th and 8th with drivers Kamui Kobayashi and Sergio Perez. Unfortunately, it was discovered that their rear wing was illegal somehow, and thus they were disqualified, thus denying them of their best result of the season. The car was at least far more reliable than its predecessor, the C29, and it would actually manage to finish in the points in the first 7 races, if you don't count the disqualifications. Double points would come at Spain with 9th and 10th, and then Kobayashi would score the car's best single result of 5th at the Monaco Grand Prix. However, at the same event, Perez would suffer a devastating crash that saw him put out of action for the next 2 Grand Prix. Kobayashi would then score 7th place in Canada, but after that, points for the car started to become harder and harder to come by, with the best result after Kobayashi's 7th being Perez scoring 7th at the British Grand Prix, his best result of the season. After his 7th place in Canada, Kobayashi would then only manage to score once in the next 10 races, a 9th place at the German Grand Prix, before finishing 10th and then 9th in the final 2 races of the season. Checo would have a slightly better time of it, scoring more frequently, including an 8th place finish in Japan. The decline in the C30's performance after such a good start to the season, if you don't count the disqualifications, ultimately meant that the team would only score 44 points across the season, the exact same number that they had scored in the previous season. but this time they were able to finish 7th in the Constructors' Championship after Williams fell down the order, having one of their worst seasons in their history. Sauber clearly still had a long way to go if they were to return to the race-winning form they had as BMW in 2008. But things would still be an improvement if they could at least stand on the podium. For 2012, Sauber entered the C31 and retained their previous driver lineup of Kamui Kobayashi and Sergio Checo Perez. The season would start well for the team, with a double points finish at the opening round in Australia, with Kobayashi leading teammate Perez home in 6th and 8th respectively. However, the next round in Malaysia would prove to be Checo's time to shine, and he brought the C31 into potential race-winning contention. The first time that Sauber had been in this position since 2008. Checo fought for most of the race with the Ferrari of Fernando Alonso, setting fastest lap after fastest lap and cutting the gap down to 1.3 seconds. But his inexperience showed when he made a mistake on lap 50, perhaps prompted by a radio message, and thus this ensured that Checo would finish the race in P2, which would still end up being the single best result that the team had ever scored as simply Sauber and not BMW. Checo would then have a 4-race pointless streak before scoring another podium in Canada, a 3rd place this time. He would then score another podium at the Italian Grand Prix, which would be the team's joint best result of the season, as Kobayashi finishing in 9th netted the team 20 points, the same amount of points they'd scored in Germany earlier in the season, just with different finishing positions. Kobayashi himself would even score a podium at his home race in Japan, making him the 3rd Japanese driver ever to score a podium in the sport. The Sauber C31 proved to be a fast and reasonably competitive car, but it was somewhat inconsistent, especially in qualifying trim. It often did very well in the races, but in qualifying it simply couldn't keep up. The decent pace of the car nonetheless earned the team a few more sponsors, including Chelsea Football Club of all things. Ultimately, the car's inconsistency became more consistent, albeit in the wrong direction, and points finishes gradually dried up for the team, with them ultimately finishing a respectable 6th in the Constructors' Championship with 126 points. The Sauber C31 is to date the latest Sauber to have stood on the podium. For 2013, Sauber entered the C32 with an all-new driver lineup, German driver Nico Hülkenberg and Mexican driver Esteban Gutierrez. This lineup proved to be completely lopsided, as Hülkenberg would score all but 6 of the team's points that season. That might sound impressive, but it really wasn't, as the C32 was far more uncompetitive than its predecessor, only managing to score 57 points, which would only be enough for 7th place in the Constructors' Championship. The team had only managed to score 7 of those points before the summer break, with results improving afterwards and Hülkenberg scoring the car's best finish of 4th in Korea. Gutierrez could only manage a single 7th place finish across the season, at the Japanese Grand Prix, where he finished behind Hülkenberg in 6th. One has to wonder how much better the car would have performed had there been an actually good driver in the second seat. Ended into the 2014 season, and driven by Adrian Sutil and Esteban Gutierrez, the Sauber C33 would be Sauber's first ever turbocharged Formula 1 car, but it would also have the unfortunate distinction of being the first and so far only Sauber to not score a single point, making this Sauber's worst season in their history. The C33 was plagued by weight issues for much of the first half of the season, issues that were so bad that Adrian Sutil, who was already tall and heavy, fasted for 2 days straight in an attempt to rectify some of the issues. It was all for naught, however, and the team would ultimately finish 10th in the Constructors' Championship, ahead of only Caterham. This season began a long period of financial difficulties for the team, and they would have to drop their driver lineup for a completely new lineup of pay drivers for the next season. Sauber's 2015 car, the C34, got off to a great start at the opening round in Australia, with Felipe Nasr finishing ahead of Marcus Ericsson in 5th and 8th respectively. Unfortunately, this opening result would prove to be the best result that the team would score all season, with points finishing being harder to come by as the season went on. Nasr proved himself to be the better driver of the pair, routinely finishing ahead of Ericsson even when the team wasn't scoring. He would contribute the lion's share of the 36 points the team scored that season, helping them secure 8th in the Constructors' Championship, a marked improvement from their previous season. However, the consequences of finishing P10 the previous year did eventually come back to bite the team, as they were unable to develop the car quickly enough, only managing to finish a narrow 9 points ahead of 9th placed McLaren. Financial difficulties hit Sauber hard for the 2016 season, as their car that year, the C35, was designed without the aid of the team's wind tunnel, as they simply couldn't afford to run it. Therefore, the C35 was very similar to its predecessor, the C34. Unfortunately, the C35 was nowhere near as competitive as its predecessor, and points would be extremely difficult to come by for the team. The C35 was at least faster than the Manor MRT-05, a car that, despite having Mercedes power, was also woefully underdeveloped, despite how good it looked. And heading into the Austrian Grand Prix weekend, Sauber was ahead of Manor in the constructors' standings, with a handful of 12th places to their name, something that Manor had been unable to achieve. However, things would go from bad to worse for Sauber at the Austrian Grand Prix when Pascal Wehrlein managed to score a single point for Manor, putting Sauber at the bottom of the table in 11th. Despite having a marginally faster car than Manor, Sauber were unable to get their car into the points for 19 Grand Prix in a row, with a best finish of 11th place in Mexico. As the F1 circus went into the penultimate round in Brazil, Sauber was getting more and more desperate for points, otherwise they would finish dead last in the championship for the first time ever, and of course, in 11th place they would receive little to no prize money. Felipe Nasr, however, would go on to score the team's first and only points of the season by finishing 9th in the sodden Brazilian Grand Prix. His home race, no less, which would double the points tally of what Manor had achieved. This put Manor into the position that Sauber had been, and ultimately led to that team collapsing in the 2016 post-season. Nasr would be rewarded for his efforts by being dropped by the team for the following season, whilst Marcus Ericsson, who was next to useless, continued to drive for the team. Meanwhile, the team underwent another change of ownership, with Peter Sauber selling the team to Longbow Finance, an investment group that might finally be able to give Sauber the money they need. For 2017, Sauber entered the gorgeous C36. Decked out in a resplendent blue, gold and white livery, the C36 would be driven by Marcus Ericsson, Pascal Wehrlein and Antonio Giovinazzi, who would substitute for Wehrlein after he was injured pre-season. The C36 definitely looked good, but unfortunately looking good does not translate into performance, as the car was yet another Sauber designed without the aid of the wind tunnel. The car was also designed around a 2016 specification Ferrari engine, and this is to date the last Formula 1 car to have used a year-old engine. This combination of factors led to the C36 being draggy, low on downforce and underpowered, making it comfortably the slowest car that season, though it was actually faster and more reliable than the McLaren Honda, at least for the first few rounds of the season, and Sauber would actually be ahead of McLaren in the constructors' standings right up until the British Grand Prix, after Wehrlein scored an 8th place in Spain after a penalty and a 10th place in Azerbaijan, meaning that as the summer break loomed, the team had 5 points going into Hungary, whilst McLaren only had 2. Unfortunately for Sauber, McLaren would then achieve a double points finish at the British Grand Prix, which would put Sauber comfortably last, and the Woking outfit would continue to regularly score points until the end of the season, something that Sauber was unable to achieve. In fact, after Azerbaijan, Sauber would fail to score points for the rest of the season, with their best result after that being Wehrlein's 12th place at the Singapore Grand Prix, an event where the McLaren of Van Dorn would finish 7th. With only 5 points to their name, Sauber would finish 10th and last in the 2017 Constructors' Championship, with all 5 points being scored by Pascal Wehrlein, something he would duly be rewarded for by being dropped for the following season. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? But things were at least looking up. With investment from Longbow Finance, the team could finally afford to run their wind tunnel again. The team would also strengthen their Ferrari ties for the following season, after briefly considering a switch to Honda engines. In one universe, the Sauber C37 was the first Sauber to be powered by Honda engines, but in our timeline it was instead the beginning of a strengthened relationship with Ferrari. This strengthened relationship brought along a new title sponsor in the form of Italian marque Alfa Romeo. The team would also receive a promising Ferrari Academy driver named Charles Leclerc, who would replace Felipe Nasr. The team would have a middling start to the 2018 season, with Ericsson retiring in the opening round and Leclerc failing to score. But then at the second round in Bahrain, Ericsson managed to score his first points since Italy 2015 by finishing 9th. Leclerc meanwhile would take until round 4 to score his first points, 6th place in Azerbaijan, which would prove to be both his and the team's single best result of the season. Leclerc went on to become a semi-regular points scorer, usually finishing in the lower half of the top 10, with 7th being his most popular position, though it would also see the beginning of his Monaco curse, his home race, when he suffered a spectacular brake failure on lap 73. Ericsson meanwhile would not score particularly frequently, and when he did, it was usually only 9th or 10th. His typically poor performances finally saw him being dropped for the following season, and he would go on to be reasonably successful in IndyCar. As for Charles Leclerc, his performances were deemed worthy enough by Ferrari to see him promoted to the Scuderia, to replace the aging Kimi Raikkonen. This meant that for 2019, Sauber had no drivers, but that wouldn't be an issue for long. One Ferrari Junior would replace another, with Antonio Giovinazzi replacing Charles Leclerc, and Raikkonen would return to the team he made his debut with, way back in 2001. As for 2018, the Sauber C37 performed reasonably well, scoring 48 points across the year, which would be enough for 8th place in the Constructors' Championship, a decent result after finishing dead last practically 2 years in a row. For 2019, Kimi Raikkonen and Antonio Giovinazzi would take charge of the Sauber engineered but Alfa Romeo badged C38. This would make the C38 the first Alfa Romeo badged car to compete in Formula 1 since 1985, a season which had gone very poorly for what was then a factory effort. The C38, however, was just badged an Alfa Romeo. It was still a Sauber underneath. Decked out in a striking white and red livery, which was an evolution of the previous year's livery, the C38 would prove to be a somewhat consistent and competitive car. Or at least it was in the hands of Raikkonen for the first half of the season before the summer break. Raikkonen would score the majority of the car's points, with Giovinazzi taking 9 rounds to score his first points of the season in Austria. 10th place, which ended up being his only points of the first half of the season. He would be somewhat more successful in the second half of the season, scoring a 9th place in Italy and a 10th place in Singapore, bringing his total to 4 points at the time. The team would have their best Grand Prix of the season at the penultimate round in Brazil, with Raikkonen leading Giovinazzi home in 4th and 5th respectively, an excellent result which propelled the team up to 8th place in the constructors' standings with 57 points to their name, as this would be their final points of the season. This points tally could have been 67, however, within touching distance of Racing Point, had both of the team's 2 cars not been given 30-second penalties for assisted starts in the German Grand Prix. They would finish 7th and 8th in that race, but would be pushed down to 12th and 13th with the penalties tacked on. Ultimately, even if these extra 10 points had been retained, it wasn't enough to allow the team to finish 7th, as the team's performance would drop off after the summer break, with Raikkonen only scoring once in the 9 races after Belgium, the aforementioned 4th place in Brazil. Perhaps this poor performance in the second half of the season was a sign of things to come. For the 2020 season, Alfa Romeo retained their 2019 driver lineup to drive the C39 to hopefully championship-winning glory. Well, let's be honest, they were never in championship contention, especially when their engine suppliers Ferrari were hit with a sanction for cheating in the previous season. This meant that the 2020 specification Ferrari engine would be down on power, which adversely affected not just the Scuderia themselves, but their customer teams Haas and Alfa Romeo. Whilst Antonio Giovinazzi would score points in the car's debut in Austria, this was largely down to the high attrition rate of that particular Grand Prix. The car would fail to score until the Tuscan Grand Prix, 8 rounds later, which again would be due to a high attrition rate in that Grand Prix. In fact, every time the C39 scored in 2020 was largely due to attrition rates in the Grand Prix, allowing the team to pick up the pieces from the others' misfortunes. The extremely poor pace of the car would be clearly demonstrated at the Italian Grand Prix, where following the race restart, the 2 Alfa Romeos were running as high as 4th and 5th, but by the time the checkered flag fell 20 laps later, they had slumped to 13th and 16th. Another demonstration of the car's poor performance came at the 70th anniversary Grand Prix in Silverstone. 70 years prior, the Alfa Romeos had locked out the 2 front rows of the grid, qualifying 1, 2, 3 and 4. But 70 years later, the 70th anniversary Grand Prix, the 2 Alfa Romeos locked out the last row of the grid, 19th and 20th. With the pace of the C39 being so poor, it was rarely in a position to score points, as mentioned before, only picking up points when others fell on misfortune. This meant that the team could only score 8 points across the 17-round season, which would only be enough for 8th in the Constructors' Championship, miles behind 7th placed AlphaTauri. And for 2021, the team would be forced to retain the car, which did not bode well. For the 2021 season, Alfa Romeo Sauber would redesignate the C39 as the C41, as the designation C40 was already being used for the car that was meant to be competing in 2021, the car that would eventually go on to become the C42. Alfa Romeo spent their development tokens improving the nose of the car, allowing it to have a slimmer design that theoretically would improve performance. Coupled with the improved 2021 specification Ferrari engine, the car was able to score more points than it did in 2020, but not much more, especially when Williams, who had scored nothing the previous season, went on to have their best season in years. While both teams would score the exact same number of times, Williams would end up scoring far better positions than Alfa Romeo did, achieving a half-points podium among other things. Meanwhile, the best position that any of the Alfa Romeos could do was 8th, with Raikkonen scoring 2 8th places at the Russian Grand Prix and the Mexico City Grand Prix. Giovinazzi could only manage 3 points across the season, which was 1 less than what he achieved in 2020. His poor performance across the season would all but seal the deal and see him being replaced for the following season. Raikkonen, meanwhile, decided to call time on his career and announced he would be retiring from the sport at the end of the season. By the time the team arrived at the season finale in Abu Dhabi, Alfa Romeo were 10 points adrift of 8th placed Williams, and they needed one hell of a good result if they wanted a chance of overtaking the Grove-based outfit. Ultimately, the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix would go very poorly for Alfa Romeo, with both cars retiring from the race, an ignominious end to both drivers' Formula 1 careers. Therefore, Alfa Romeo Sauber would finish the 2021 season placed 9th in the Constructors' Championship with only 13 points to their name. But they hadn't been idle among their pursuits. 2021 was more or less a year that they had written off to focus on 2022. For the 2022 season, Alfa Romeo introduced the C42 and a completely new driver lineup in the form of the Flying Finn, Valtteri Bottas, and Chinese rookie Zhou Guanyu. The team's development work of the car appeared to have paid off, as the team would score double points in the season opening round in Bahrain, with Bottas leading Zhou home in 6th and 10th respectively. The next few rounds would be reasonably successful for the team, as Bottas would be a regular point scorer, managing the car's best finishing position of 5th at the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix at Imola. Zhou Guanyu, on the other hand, was less fortunate. He suffered from several reliability issues during the first half of the season, retiring 5 times before the summer break. Zhou would only go on to score 3 times across the entire season, with his best finishing position being in 8th place at the Canadian Grand Prix, coming in just behind 7th placed Bottas. The Canadian Grand Prix would go on to be the team's best performance across the season, and it would mark the end of the car's competitive streak. After this, the C42 lost a lot of its pace relative to the rest of the field. What had once been a solid midfield car suddenly slipped it down the order and was routinely finishing outside of the points. Bottas could only score twice more, with the best finishing position of 9th at the Sao Paulo Grand Prix. With the team holding on to 6th place in the constructors' standings, that put them under threat from Aston Martin, who were gradually catching up to them after suffering a poor start of the season themselves. Had it not been for Bottas scoring 10th in Mexico and 9th in Sao Paulo, Alfa Romeo would have just lost 6th place to Aston Martin in the Constructors' Championship. Instead, they would go on to finish level on points, but Alfa Romeo would come out on top owing to Bottas' 5th place in Imola, the crucial result that tipped the scales in their favour. Whilst it was hoped that the team's lack of performance in the second half of the season was just a result of switching development to the next year's car, it would ultimately prove to be a sign of things to come. 2023 would be the last year that the Sauber team would have Alfa Romeo as their title sponsor, meaning that once the season was done and dusted, the Alfa Romeo name would once again disappear from Formula 1. And perhaps it was a case of good riddance, because the Alfa Romeo C43 was one of the least competitive cars to compete in that season. It may have already been a season dominated by Red Bull, but if there was a backmarker championship, this would have finished second place. It was a return to form for Alfa Romeo, in the wrong direction, as they would only go on to score 16 points across the season, 3 more than they achieved in 2021. In fact, had it not been for a double points finish in Qatar, the team would have finished 10th and last, again. Just 2 points behind Haas, though in the end they ended up just 4 points ahead of Haas, in 9th in the Constructors' Championship. The reason for the team losing so much pace compared to how they started 2022 is largely due to the impending Audi takeover. Former team principal Fred Vasseur would be snapped up by Scuderia Ferrari, and he would be replaced by former McLaren team principal Andreas Seidl. Seidl's management style evidently clashed with the personality of Valtteri Bottas, who felt that the team was declining extremely fast, and the C43's lack of performance was certainly proof of this. Nevertheless, the team's 2 drivers would continue to see out their contracts, even as the team slipped further and further down the order. The best position the car could achieve all season were 2 8th places at the hands of Bottas, 1 in Bahrain and 1 in Qatar, whilst Zhou Guanyu could manage only a trio of 9th place finishes. It was certainly a season to forget for Alfa Romeo. Though it certainly wasn't their worst season in the sport since their return, the Alfa Romeo name would leave the sport on a whimper, and not a bang, though it did leave with a kick. With the Alfa Romeo name gone for 2024, Sauber returned to the grid under their original name, with a few sponsors tacked on. Kick Team Sauber is officially the name of the team now, though of course no one calls it that, it's Sauber. Bottas and Zhou would drive the C44 in what would end up being Sauber's worst season in 8 years. The performance of the C44 was described by team owners Audi as unacceptably poor, with the car starting the season as the 2nd worst on the grid, then slumping to definite worst, and by the end of the season it was actually slightly better owing to a late season upgrade that saw the car score its first and only points of the season at the Qatar Grand Prix at the hands of Zhou Guanyu, a single 8th placed finish being all that the C44 could achieve. Not even Bottas, who was highly experienced, could pull a single point out of this car, making 2024 his first season where he failed to score. A lot of the issues with the car can be pinned down on troubles behind the scenes. Andreas Seidl, who had only been team principal for a year, was already out by the time the summer break rolled around, and he would be replaced by former Ferrari team principal Mattia Binotto. A lot of the car's early season issues came at the hands of newly designed lightweight wheel nuts that ended up cross-threading a lot more often than they would have been liked, which ideally is never. These things were cross-threading and pit stops almost every single time, and as a result, pit stops could be up to 50 seconds in length, One journalist even attributed the car's lack of performance to Audi fixating on the 2026 season when they would enter the sport under their own name, and that they were purposefully neglecting the Sauber name. By the time the season finished, Sauber had only 4 points to their name, enough for only 10th and last in the Constructors' Championship. Both drivers, Bottas and Zhou, would be ejected from the team at the end of the season and replaced by Nico Hülkenberg and Gabriel Bortoleto for 2025. And after pre-season testing, let's be honest, things aren't looking up for this team. Bring on 2026?